I knew my family never saw much in me, but nothing cut deeper than hearing my own brother tell a room full of relatives that my life was proof some people just never become anything. He said it like a fact, like I wasn't even there. And in that moment, something in me cracked so quietly no one noticed. Except me. I'm Victoria. I reached Portland just as dusk tightened over the city, the cold settling in a thin, brittle layer that coated everything it touched. The maple leaves along the street gathered in uneven piles, and for a moment I felt the odd ache of remembering a place that no longer felt like mine. When I stepped out of the car and saw my brother's two-story house again, the familiarity struck me and slipped away just as quickly, like something I couldn't quite hold. Michael opened the door with a smile that wavered at the edges, his eyes scanning me as if comparing this version of me with one he'd stored away years ago. Laura appeared behind him, still holding a wooden spoon, her greeting warm in sound but distant in intent. I slipped off my coat and hung it by the door, the faint brine still clinging to it, a reminder of the life I'd built far from here. The kitchen glowed softly, filled with faces I had known all my life, yet I felt strangely removed, as if I were walking into a photograph rather than a memory. They asked how Maine was, whether it felt lonely, if I ever thought of moving back somewhere more connected. Their curiosity was polite, careful, and unmistakably probing. I answered lightly, giving them only what was necessary, silverware scraped gently as dinner was served, pulling up the ghosts of quieter meals when my mother still presided at the head of the table. Tonight, the conversation spiraled around careers, renovations, and travel plans. I was mentioned only in passing, as though my life existed on the outskirts of theirs. I simply listened, watching the distance between us stretch, unaware that before the night ended, it would stretch farther than any of us imagined. The tone at the table shifted after the wine made its rounds, and the basket of garlic bread settled between us, without meaning to. Everyone drifted toward the years we rarely acknowledged, grazing the edges of memories no one wanted to touch too hard. My hand tightened around the napkin when Laura began talking about how our mother had shouldered everything alone near the end. She spoke with that careful sympathy people use when they're confident they understood the story. I let her talk. There was no reasonable way to interrupt and say she only knew half of what happened. I had been there in those final days through the long nights, the short breaths, the whispered apologies meant only for me, but at this table, the version they reconstructed belonged to them, not to the woman I had held on to when she couldn't hold on to anything else. I sat still and let their words pass like a tide that didn't know it had pulled away from the shore a long time ago. When my napkin slid off my lap, I reached down to grab it, and that was when my phone vibrated sharp, insistent, nothing like a casual notification. I pressed my hand over it to keep the sound from carrying. It rattled once more, a vibration that shot straight through me. I knew that pattern. I hadn't felt it in years, but my body remembered before my mind did. I angled the screen just long enough to see the red-coded alert. 14 red. Level. Priority. My breath stalled. This wasn't the kind of message you ignored. Not the kind meant to appear while you were sitting at a family dinner pretending to belong. I locked the phone fast and tucked it under the tablecloth, hoping the moment had passed unnoticed. But a faint pulse of light brushed against my collarbone. I looked down. The pendant I always wore had begun to glow with the same coded flicker. Before I could shield it, one of the kids leaned closer. "Aunt Vic, why is your necklace lighting up?" That single question opened a seam in the room. Laura's eyes cut toward me, sharper than before, and Michael's confused smile appeared, as if he hoped I'd laugh everything off. I didn't. Just something I keep with me. I told them. It helps. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't an explanation either. The pendant dimmed under my palm, its job done, leaving a faint warmth that hadn't been there a moment earlier. The conversation resumed, but something underneath had shifted. I felt it like a thread pulled too tight. No one else sensed the change. But I knew better. Signals like that didn't come without reason. Whatever I had been avoiding was no longer distant. It had found me right here, in the one place I had hoped to slip through unnoticed. And from that quiet flicker onward, nothing about the night would stay ordinary. I stayed at the end of the table, keeping my eyes on the glass in front of me so I wouldn't have to meet the glances circling from either side. What had started as mild awkwardness had thickened into something heavier, something that clung to every pause in conversation. The harmless chatter from earlier began to sharpen, slipping into comments that carried a different weight. Each time someone mentioned careers or stability or achievements, I could feel Michael's gaze land on me before drifting away again, as if waiting for me to flinch. It felt strangely familiar, the way the room tilted back toward old habits. I hadn't felt this particular kind of scrutiny since I was 17, sitting at the same table, knowing every opinion about my future had already been decided without me. Laura leaned back with her wine, her tone playful on the surface but edged underneath. Life up in Maine must be pretty quiet, right? Not much going on day to day. Her husband followed with an attempt at a laugh, asking if I'd ever thought of moving somewhere with more opportunities, maybe even back to Portland where things were supposedly happening. Their questions slid in smoothly, but none of them were meant to understand anything about me. They were reminders, gentle, practiced reminders of where they believed I belonged in the unspoken hierarchy of this family. When dessert plates were placed in front of us, Michael set his down with a firmness that belonged more to a different kind of conversation. He looked straight at me, and there was no attempt to hide what he wanted. 12 years gone. Vic, no one knows where you've been or what you've been doing. You only show up when someone reaches out. I just want to understand where your life is heading. Everything at the table stilled. The adults froze mid-movement. The kids stopped tapping their spoons. No one dared fill the silence. They just watched me, waiting for a confession I had no intention of giving. I kept my voice steady when I finally answered. Enough to live quietly. Michael frowned, unsatisfied. Quiet isn't a direction. You need something more concrete. He wanted remorse. He wanted validation for the picture he'd drawn of me all these years. I didn't give him either. My silence pushed him further. You had potential once, but it's like you drifted off course for over a decade. Don't you think the rest of us wonder how it came to this? The word he used sank quickly, rippling through the room. I heard a faint vibration behind me, a soft tremor through the window pane. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it wasn't. But it reached me the way certain sounds do when they connect to something deeper. I felt my pulse slow, a familiar shift in my body, a transition into the kind of awareness I had been trained never to ignore. Michael was still talking, insisting on responsibility, commitment, family duty, but his voice blurred into the background as another quick vibration hit my phone short. Sharp, unmistakable. I covered the movement by adjusting my napkin, steadying my breath as I pressed the screen to silence. This was no ordinary alert. I knew that pattern too well. Michael's voice rose again, frustrated. Everyone here works hard to keep this family together, but you're always gone. You're never here when it matters. The words struck deeper than he realized, not because they were true, but because he had never once paused long enough to see where I had actually been all those times he claimed I wasn't. I opened my mouth, ready to stop the conversation from spiraling further. But then it happened. A low, distant rumble rolled through the air, slow at first, almost like the churn of wind against metal. But it wasn't wind. It was moving closer. And in that instant, I understood with absolute certainty that this night had already crossed the point of no return. The rumble rising in the distance no longer blended with the wind. It was heavier, deeper, carrying a vibration that settled into my ribs before my ears fully registered it. I knew that sound. I had heard it in storms over open water, felt it shake steel decks beneath my boots, watched it carve through fog thick enough to swallow entire ships. Machines that size didn't drift aimlessly. They arrived with purpose and never by accident. Inside Michael's dining room, the noise seeped under the chatter, a muffled disturbance that twisted the air just enough for my pulse to shift. Every instinct I had learned through years of conditioning snapped awake. When that kind of engine pushed this low, it meant someone had been trying to reach me for longer than my family would ever understand. If they were here in a person, then remote channels had failed, or time had run out. Laura paused mid-sentence, her hand suspended halfway to her mouth. Michael turned toward the window as a faint rattle rolled across the glass. A single water glass trembled against the wooden table, barely noticeable unless you knew what to listen for. I did. I stood slowly, hoping the movement might go unnoticed, but Michael's head whipped toward me. "Vic, what is that?" The sharpness from earlier had drained from his voice, replaced with a tone I rarely heard from him, uncertainty. I didn't answer. Any explanation I could give him would only create more questions, none of which I intended to answer in the middle of a family dinner that had already started to unravel. A sudden sweep of white light cut across the back window, scanning the yard with precision. The maple trees bent violently under a blast of air, leaves swirling in frantic spirals. Laura shot upright, knocking her chair backward. "What is that who flies that low over a neighborhood?" The kids scrambled to the window, pressed against the glass with a mixture of awe and fear. I rushed forward, pulling them back before the next surge of wind battered the pane. "Stay back," I told them, keeping my voice measured even as the roar grew louder. Michael approached me again, studying my face with a seriousness that made him look older than he had an hour ago. "You know what's happening, don't you?" Before I had the chance to speak, the engines thundered through the walls, shaking the entire house. A massive shadow swept over the ceiling, darkening the room for a heartbeat. The chandelier swayed violently, its crystals clattering together in sharp and frantic tones. Laura shrieked as she shielded her children. My brother-in-law flattened himself against the wall, wide-eyed and pale. Then, as if pulled by instinct, Michael moved toward the door leading to the yard and cracked it open. The wind slammed into it instantly. "Don't!" I said, gripping his arm. "Not with that downdraft." His eyes widened at the certainty in my voice. "How do you even know?" The question died on his lips as the MH-60S Seahawk dropped fully into view, descending straight into the backyard. The lawn erupted into chaos. Dry leaves launched into the air like shrapnel. Patio chairs skittered across the concrete. The rotor wash hit the house with a force that made the siding creak. Laura's voice rose above the noise. "Who are they here for, Michael? Close the door." He peeked through the curtain again, face drained of every trace of color. "Someone's getting out." I didn't need to look. I recognized the silhouette before it even touched the ground. The helmet, the stance, the precision, every detail belonged to a unit that never deployed, unless the stakes had reached a level most civilians would never even hear whispers about. Laura turned toward me, hands trembling. "Vic, what did you get yourself into?" I drew a long, steady breath. Whatever was coming couldn't be stopped by explanations or reassurances. Then came the knock. Not a polite tap or a frantic pounding firm. Efficient strikes from someone trained to communicate urgency without wasted motion. Michael froze mid-step. No one dared move. I walked toward the door. This time, no one tried to interfere. The roar outside swallowed every sound inside the house as I pulled the handle. Wind whipped against my face the moment the door cracked open. And there he stood, illuminated by the helicopter's floodlights helmet tucked under one arm. Radio cable dangling from his flight suit, eyes locked on mine with absolute purpose. In that moment, with the engines thundering behind him, I knew the truth with cold clarity. Tonight had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The officer stood framed in the doorway of Michael's back porch, his breath fogging in the cold night air. He adjusted the volume on his headset with a practiced touch, then swept his gaze across the yard to confirm the landing zone was secure. When his eyes locked on me, his posture snapped into rigid precision, heels clicking together in a movement drilled into him long before tonight. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cutting clean through the roar of the rotor blades overhead. "We had to approach directly. Long-range communications are experiencing severe interference." Behind me, I heard Laura release a sound that was half gasp, half stunned choke. Michael remained frozen, wide-eyed, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding in his own backyard. I leaned slightly into the wind, letting the sting of salt and engine exhaust ground me. "Priority level," I asked, keeping my tone level. "Level Omega." He answered instantly. 3 active hot zones. We've been waiting for confirmation of your location for 20 minutes. 20 minutes? While Michael dissected my life at the dinner table, the world outside had been trying to reach me with an urgency only a handful of people ever encountered. Inside the house, frantic whispers rose disjointed, panicked, scraping at the edges of the moment. I didn't turn toward them. My attention stayed fixed on the officer. Formation established, I asked. Assembling at Trident Pier. Admiral? That name hit me like a cold blade down my spine. They never used it unless every other barrier had fallen. I nodded slowly. Understood. I need 3 minutes. He didn't question it. He simply gave a crisp salute and stepped back into the blinding wash of the helicopter lights. When I closed the door, the house felt different, smaller, tighter. Every face stretched with confusion and dawning fear. They formed an unintentional semicircle around me, as if bracing for an answer they weren't ready to hear. Laura spoke first, her voice thin. Vic, what is happening? Why did he call you that before I could respond? Michael cut in, speaking in a hoarse whisper, as though the officer might still be listening. Admiral, is that actually you? The look on his face was one I had never seen on him. Not dominance, not judgment, but fear. God, not fear of me. Fear that the story he'd believed about me his whole life had never been true. I answered softly, without apology or embellishment. It's a name for the work I do, not for family dinners. The silence that followed pressed heavy against the walls, settling over all of them like a cold, undeniable truth. Michael braced himself against the edge of the table, gripping it as though he needed something solid to keep from collapsing under the weight of what he had just witnessed. His children clung to their parents' legs, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes, as if I had shifted into someone they could no longer recognize. Laura stepped forward, confusion tightening her voice. How long have you been in the military? Why didn't you ever say anything? How could none of us know? Because I wasn't allowed to. I answered, keeping my tone calm, steady, unmoved by the storm building around us, and because even if I had said something, no one would have believed me. The truth hung there, sharp and slow, settling into the floorboards. It wasn't anger. It wasn't accusation. It was simply the reality I had lived with. Michael shook his head, an incredulous laugh breaking in his throat but never forming fully. My God, how is it where did you go? What were you doing all those years? We all thought you were just drifting. I held his gaze. I wasn't drifting. I was doing the work assigned to me, and that work was never meant to be understood in this house. From the far corner, my brother-in-law finally found his voice, trembling as he spoke. If they came for you the way they just did, that means tonight, something serious is happening, doesn't it? I nodded once, serious enough that they exhausted every other way to reach me. A violent burst of rotor wash slammed against the back windows, making the glass shudder in its frame. The helicopter was lowering, urging, pressing for time. Laura stared at me, her voice barely a whisper. You've lived like this for years, all alone. I let the question sit for a heartbeat before answering. I've done what I had to do. Nothing more, nothing less. No one spoke after that. The silence that filled the room was unlike any I had grown up with. It wasn't dismissive or cold. It wasn't meant to shrink me. For the first time in my life, the silence was acknowledgement, an admission they never had the courage to give out loud. I pulled my coat on and fastened the buttons with the quick, automatic motion that had once carried me through emergencies far harsher than this quiet suburban night. When I turned back, they were all still standing exactly where I had left them. No one tried to stop me. No one reached out. No one attempted to fill the moment with the kind of hollow reassurances families often cling to. Whatever they thought they knew had already fallen apart. Stepping out the back door, the wind struck hard, whipping my hair across my face. The helicopter's floodlights carved a wide white circle across the yard, transforming the grass into a temporary landing zone. The officer stood waiting, arm lifted to guide me toward the steps. I looked back once, just once. They filled the doorway like silhouettes caught between disbelief and fear. The warm yellow light behind them stretching their shadows long across the lawn. No apologies came, no confessions. But I didn't need any of it to recognize the truth settling heavily in their eyes. Don't look at me with the darkness of tonight, I told them softly, the words nearly swallowed by the wind. I've always been who you knew. You just never saw me clearly. Then I turned away, climbing the metal steps. I felt something uncoil inside me, a part of my life slipping off my shoulders as if it had been waiting for this moment. The cabin door sealed shut, engines rising to a thunderous pitch, and within seconds, Michael's house shrank beneath us, a faint, glowing box swallowed by the night. Through the small round window, I saw them motionless under the porch light, small, stunned, and finally silent in a way they had never been with me. I let out a slow breath and closed my eyes, not in exhaustion, but in release. For the first time in years, the sky opened without weight, and I rose into it with nothing left to prove.